The trading station orbited the neutral zone between human and Zelkari space, a massive metal wheel spinning slowly against the starfield. Inside its crowded markets and dimly lit cantinas, beings from dozens of species conducted business while trying not to kill each other. The air recyclers worked overtime to handle the mix of atmospheric requirements, creating a thick soup of alien scents and industrial lubricants. Commander Vextar of the Zelkari Empire strutted through the main corridor like he owned the place. His scaled hide gleamed under the harsh lighting, and his uniform bore the marks of a decorated military officer. Behind him followed a small entourage of junior officers and hangers-on, all eager to bask in the reflected glory of his presence. "You see," Vextar was saying to his audience, his voice carrying the particular smugness that came with absolute certainty, "humans are nothing more than clever animals. They think their little rebellions and desperate last stands make them special, but I have personally overseen the pacification of 17 human colonies." A Korthani merchant nodded enthusiastically. "The great Commander Vextar speaks truth. We have all heard the stories of human stubbornness, but surely it means nothing against proper military strategy." Vextar's chest swelled with pride. He loved an appreciative audience. Stubbornness? Is that what they call it? I call it stupidity. These humans throw themselves against superior forces like insects against a flame. I have watched thousands of them die rather than surrender to obviously superior opponents. The group had gathered near one of the station's many bars, an establishment that catered to oxygen-breathing species. The bartender, a six-armed Hectron, continued polishing glasses with mechanical precision while pretending not to listen to the increasingly loud conversation. "Tell us about the Kepler-7 incident," suggested a young Zelkari lieutenant. "I have heard rumors, but never the full account from someone who was actually there." Vextar's eyes gleamed. This was his favorite story, the one that had earned him his current rank and considerable reputation within the Empire. Ah, Kepler-7. Now that was a perfect example of human foolishness in action. He gestured dramatically, and his audience leaned in closer. Even some nearby patrons had begun to listen, drawn by the commander's booming voice and confident manner. The humans had established a mining colony on Kepler-7, a worthless rock of a planet with barely breathable air and gravity that would crush most civilized species. But humans, being the stubborn creatures they are, insisted on scratching out an existence there. When the Empire decided to claim the system for strategic purposes, I was given the honor of removing the infestation. A Yutani trader who had been eavesdropping couldn't help but interject. "But surely they evacuated when they saw your fleet approach? Even humans are not completely insane." Vextar laughed, a harsh sound that sent shivers through several nearby species. "Evacuate? These fools had nowhere to go. We had surrounded the system with 3 full battle groups. Their pathetic little transport ships would have been vaporized the moment they lifted off. I offered them generous terms, surrender unconditionally and accept relocation to a more suitable world under Empire protection." "And they refused?" The Korthani merchant seemed genuinely puzzled by this concept. "Not only did they refuse," Vextar continued, his voice rising with each word, "but their so-called leader, a grizzled old miner named Patterson, told my negotiator that they would see us in hell first." Can you imagine such arrogance from a species that barely learned to leave their home planet a few centuries ago? The crowd was growing larger now. Word had spread that Commander Vextar was telling war stories, and many beings found such tales entertaining, especially when they featured the defeat of the troublesome humans who had been making life difficult for several galactic empires lately. "What happened next?" prompted the lieutenant. Vextar savored the moment. "I gave them exactly what they asked for. We began with orbital bombardment of their defensive positions. Their shields lasted perhaps an hour against our capital ship weapons. Then, we sent in the ground forces to finish the job." He paused for effect, scanning his audience's faces. "Do you know what those insane humans did when they realized their shields were failing? They didn't surrender. They didn't try to negotiate. Instead, they rigged their entire mining operation to explode." Gasps arose from several listeners. Even species accustomed to warfare found the idea of such wholesale destruction shocking. They turned their own homes into a weapon, Vexstar continued with obvious satisfaction. When my troops breached their perimeter, Patterson himself triggered the charges. The explosion was visible from orbit. It killed every human on the planet instantly, along with nearly 2,000 of my finest soldiers. The Yutani traders' antennae twitched nervously. They committed suicide rather than surrender? Their entire population? Every last one, Vexstar confirmed proudly. Men, women, children, elderly, they chose mutual annihilation over the simple acceptance of superior authority. It was the most perfectly human response imaginable, wasteful, pointless, and, ultimately self-defeating. A new voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Sounds like they won to me. The group turned to see where the comment had come from. At a small table in the corner sat a lone human, apparently female, though it was sometimes difficult for other species to tell with certainty. She appeared young by human standards, with short dark hair and clothes that had seen better days. Most notably, she wasn't showing any of the fear or deference that other beings typically displayed when Commander Vexstar was holding court. Vexstar's expression shifted from smugness to irritation. "Excuse me?" The human took a sip from her drink before responding. "I said it sounds like they won. You wanted their planet and their resources. They made sure you couldn't have either. That's not self-defeating, that's denying the enemy their objective." A dangerous silence fell over the gathering. Several aliens began to edge away from what was clearly about to become an unpleasant situation. Commander Vexstar was not known for his tolerance of contradiction, especially from members of inferior species. "Little human," Vexstar said slowly, his voice dropping to a menacing growl, "you seem to misunderstand the situation. I eliminated an entire world of your kind. They are dead. I am alive and victorious. How exactly does that constitute their victory?" The human finally looked up from her drink, meeting his gaze directly. Her eyes held no fear, only what appeared to be mild amusement. "Because you're here bragging about it to strangers in a bar instead of enjoying the fruits of your conquest. You got nothing from Kepler-7 except a pile of rubble and a lot of dead soldiers. Meanwhile, those miners made sure that their sacrifice meant something." Vexstar's claws extended slightly, scraping against the metal table he was leaning on. Their sacrifice meant nothing except that they died as stubbornly as they lived. The Empire still controls that system. "Controls what exactly?" the human asked. "A dead rock with a crater where the colony used to be? That must have been a really valuable prize to justify losing 2,000 troops." The commander's entourage was beginning to look uncomfortable. This was not going according to the usual script, where Vexstar's war stories were met with appropriate awe and admiration. The human seemed completely unimpressed by his reputation or his threats. "Perhaps," suggested the Korthani merchant nervously, "we should return to our business discussions." But Vexstar was not about to let this challenge pass. His military career had been built on projecting strength and dominance, and allowing a lone human to mock him in public would damage his carefully cultivated reputation. "You speak with great confidence for someone whose species is known throughout the galaxy for dying in pointless gestures," he said, moving closer to the human's table. "Tell me, little one, have you ever actually seen combat? Or do you simply repeat the propaganda your leaders feed you about human bravery?" The human finished her drink and set the glass down carefully. "I've seen enough combat to recognize the difference between tactics and slaughter. What you're describing isn't military genius, it's just superior firepower used against people who couldn't fight back effectively." "They fought back," Vexstar snarled. "They simply lost because they were inferior." "They fought back the only way they could," the human corrected. "And they made you pay for your victory. That's not inferior, that's making the best of a bad situation." The crowd was growing restless. This verbal sparring could easily escalate into violence, and most of the observers had no desire to be caught in the crossfire if it came to that. Station security would eventually intervene, but their response time was notoriously slow in this sector. Vexstar leaned over the human's table, using his considerable height advantage to loom over her. "Your species has a talent for making bad situations worse. I have personally witnessed human stupidity on 17 worlds, and it never fails to amaze me how consistently you choose death over reason.
Maybe, the human said calmly, it's not stupidity. Maybe we just have different definitions of what's worth dying for.
Such as?
Freedom. Dignity.
The right to decide our own fate instead of accepting whatever scraps some empire wants to throw us.
Vexstar laughed harshly.
Pretty words from someone who has never faced real consequences for such idealism. It's easy to talk about dying for freedom when you're sitting safely in a neutral trading station.
The human stood up slowly.
She was smaller than Vexstar had expected, most humans were, but something in her posture suggested that size might not be as important as he'd assumed.
You're right about one thing, she said. It is easy to talk about these things when you're safe. The real test comes when you're not safe anymore.
Indeed it does, Vexstar agreed, his hand moving to rest on his sidearm.
Perhaps you would like to demonstrate this human courage you speak of so fondly?
Before anyone could react, the human smiled. It was not a pleasant expression.
Actually, Commander, I think you're the one who needs to demonstrate something.
You've spent the last hour telling everyone how tough you are and how easily you defeat humans. But you're picking a fight with someone half your size in a crowded bar where station security will break it up before either of us gets seriously hurt. She took a step closer to him, apparently unconcerned by the fact that he outweighed her by at least 50 kilograms and had natural weapons that could tear through human flesh like paper.
If you really want to prove that human courage is just stupidity, she continued, why don't we take this somewhere more private? I know a place.
The crowd began to murmur among themselves.
This was unexpected.
Humans were supposed to be the ones who made reckless challenges, not the ones who responded to them with apparent calm calculation. Vexstar found himself in an uncomfortable position. He couldn't back down from a challenge issued by a lone human without losing face in front of his subordinates and the other beings who had gathered to hear his stories. But something about the human's demeanor was setting off warning signals in the tactical part of his mind. You're suggesting single combat, he asked. I'm suggesting we settle this debate about human capabilities in a way that provides clear evidence one way or the other, the human replied.
Unless you'd prefer to keep trading insults in public?
The young Zalkari lieutenant stepped forward.
Commander, surely this is beneath your dignity. She's obviously trying to provoke you into doing something foolish.
The human turned her attention to the lieutenant.
What's your name, soldier?
Sub-Commander Kreltios, he replied automatically, then immediately looked annoyed with himself for answering. Well, Sub-Commander Kreltios, your commander here has been bragging about how he's killed thousands of humans in combat.
If that's true, then one more shouldn't be a problem for him.
Unless, of course, he only fights humans when he has overwhelming advantages in numbers and firepower.
Vexstar's growl deepened.
The human was maneuvering him into a position where refusing her challenge would make him look weak, while accepting it carried unknown risks. He had not survived long enough to reach his current rank by accepting unnecessary gambles. But he also couldn't afford to appear cowardly in front of his men and the other beings present. His authority depended on maintaining an image of absolute confidence and dominance. Very well, he said finally.
Single combat it is. Where did you have in mind? The human smile widened slightly. There's a cargo bay about 10 minutes from here. Level 7, Section 12.
It's been decommissioned for months, nobody goes there anymore.
We can settle this without interruption.
She gathered up her jacket from the back of her chair and headed toward the exit. As she reached the doorway, she paused and looked back.
Oh, and, Commander? You might want to bring a weapon. Something tells me you're going to need it.
With that, she disappeared into the corridor, leaving behind a room full of confused and nervous aliens who weren't sure what they had just witnessed. Vexstar stood in the sudden silence, realizing that he had somehow been maneuvered into exactly the kind of situation he normally avoided. But, with dozens of witnesses to the challenge, he had no choice but to follow through. Sir, Kreltios said quietly, perhaps we should contact station security.
Absolutely not, Vexstar snapped. I will not have it said that I needed help to deal with a single human female.
We go to this cargo bay, I demonstrate the superiority of Zelkari military training, and, then, we return to finish our business here.
He checked his sidearm and started toward the door. Besides, he added with forced confidence, what could possibly go wrong?
The decommissioned cargo bay stretched out like a metal cavern, dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast long shadows between the support pillars. The air recycling system here worked intermittently, creating an atmosphere that was technically breathable but hardly pleasant. Abandoned cargo containers and maintenance equipment littered the space, creating a maze of potential cover and obstacles.
Commander Vexstar arrived with his full entourage, despite the human's suggestion of single combat.
He wasn't about to face an unknown opponent without backup, regardless of what honor might dictate. His hand rested confidently on his military-grade plasma pistol, a weapon that could punch through most personal armor and had never failed him in previous encounters. The human was already there, sitting casually on a cargo container in the center of the bay. She had removed her jacket, revealing arms that showed the lean muscle definition of someone accustomed to physical labor. More interestingly, she wore a small device on her wrist that Vexstar didn't immediately recognize. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind," she called out as the Zelkari group entered the bay. "I don't change my mind," Vexstar replied, drawing his weapon and advancing into the open space. "I said single combat, but my subordinates insisted on witnessing your defeat."
"I trust you have no objection to an audience?" The human shrugged. "The more the merrier. Makes it easier to spread the word about what happens here." Krell-TOS activated a portable recording device. For official records, he explained to his commander. "In case there are questions later about the circumstances." "Excellent thinking," Vexstar approved. "Let there be no doubt about how this encounter concludes." The human slid off the container and stretched, working the kinks out of her shoulders and neck. "Before we begin, I should probably introduce myself. The name's Sarah Chen. I'm what your intelligence files probably list as a colonial auxiliary, someone who grew up on the frontier worlds." "Your name is irrelevant," Vexstar said, though he filed the information away automatically. "You are about to become another casualty statistic in the long history of human overconfidence." "Funny thing about statistics," Sarah replied conversationally. "They don't always tell the whole story. For instance, those 17 human colonies you mentioned conquering? I bet your reports didn't include much detail about the casualties you took in the process." Vexstar's expression darkened. "Every military operation involves acceptable losses. The important thing is achieving the strategic objective." "Oh, I agree completely. Strategy is everything in warfare. Which brings me to something I've been curious about. What exactly is your strategy for this encounter?" The question caught Vexstar off guard. It seemed obvious enough. "I have superior size, strength, natural weapons, military training, and advanced equipment. You have none of these advantages. My strategy is to apply overwhelming force until you are no longer a threat." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good strategy against most opponents. Very straightforward. But, you're making an assumption that might not be accurate." "What assumption?" "You're assuming I'm most opponents." Before Vexstar could respond, Sarah pressed something on her wrist device. The bay's lighting suddenly shifted, the emergency illumination cycling through different frequencies and intensities. At the same time, a low-frequency hum began emanating from speakers hidden throughout the space. "What is this?" Krell-TOS demanded, raising his own weapon. "Oh, just some environmental modifications," Sarah said casually. "See, the thing about growing up on frontier worlds is that you learn to adapt to all sorts of hostile conditions. Gravity that's too high, atmosphere that's too thin, radiation levels that would kill most species, temperature swings that can freeze or cook you depending on the time of day." The lighting continued to shift, creating a strobe effect that was disorienting to most alien species but didn't seem to bother Sarah at all. The sound frequency was hitting ranges that made the Zelkari soldiers uncomfortable, interfering with their inner ear balance. "We learned to fight in environments that would incapacitate someone from a more civilized world," she continued, beginning to move in a slow circle around Vexstar. That's the first thing you got wrong about humans. We don't just live on Deathworlds, we adapt to them. We become part of them.
Vexstar fired his plasma pistol, a brilliant bolt that should have ended the conversation immediately. But Sarah was no longer where she had been when he pulled the trigger. The strobing lights and shifting shadows had hidden her movement, and she was now behind one of the cargo containers. The second thing you got wrong, her voice came from a different direction entirely, is thinking that equipment advantages are permanent.
You have better weapons than me, sure.
But weapons are only as good as your ability to use them effectively.
Another plasma bolt lit up the bay, this one aimed at where her voice had originated.
But, again, there was nothing there but empty air and metal. See, Commander, the problem with relying on superior firepower is that it makes you lazy. You expect your enemies to stand still and fight you on your terms. But humans who survive on Deathworlds learn to make their own terms. Vexstar was beginning to feel genuinely concerned.
This was not going according to plan.
His thermal vision was being confused by the environmental controls Sarah had activated, and the sound was making it difficult to track her movement by hearing. Worse, his own weapon's energy signature was interfering with his targeting systems.
Kreltos, he barked, circle around to the left. Establish a crossfire pattern.
Sir, you said single combat.
I said no such thing. This human is using tricks and deception.
We respond with proper military tactics. But, as Kreltos moved to comply, he discovered that the maze of cargo containers was more complex than it had appeared. What had looked like clear lines of sight from the entrance were revealed to be an intricate network of blind spots and cover positions. Sarah had chosen the battlefield, and she had chosen well. The third thing you got wrong, Sarah's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, is assuming that human tactics are based on stupidity rather than adaptation. Those miners on Kepler 7 didn't choose to die because they were too dumb to surrender. They chose to die because they understood something you didn't. A small object flew through the air and landed near Vexstar's feet.
He jumped back instinctively, expecting an explosive device.
Instead, it was simply a piece of metal debris that clanged harmlessly against the deck. What did they understand? He called out, angry at himself for being startled by such a simple trick. They understood that some battles are about more than winning or losing. Some battles are about sending a message to everyone who comes after.
And that message was simple: humans don't break.
This time when Vexstar fired, he aimed not at a specific target but at the cargo container he thought Sarah might be hiding behind. The plasma blast tore through the metal like paper, vaporizing anything that might have been on the other side.
Nothing. You're running out of ammunition, Sarah observed from yet another location.
Standard Zelkari military sidearm, model 743. 30 shots maximum, takes 45 seconds to swap power cells under ideal conditions.
You've fired 7 rounds so far.
Vexstar's blood ran cold. She had been counting his shots and apparently knew the specifications of his weapon better than she should have. That level of tactical awareness suggested military training despite her civilian appearance.
Who are you? He demanded. I told you. Sarah Chen, Colonial Auxiliary. But what I didn't mention is which colony I'm auxiliary to.
Another piece of debris flew through the air, this time from a completely different angle. Vexstar was beginning to realize that Sarah was moving through the cargo bay with a speed and confidence that spoke of intimate familiarity with the terrain. I'm from Hadley's Hope, she continued.
Ever heard of it?
Vexstar's weapon hand began to shake slightly. Hadley's Hope was legendary throughout both human and alien military circles. It was the frontier world that had held off a full-scale Korthani invasion for 8 months using nothing but militia forces and improvised weapons. The casualty figures from that campaign were still classified, but rumors suggested they had been catastrophic for the invading force. Hadley's Hope was evacuated last year, Kreltos said weakly. Some of us were evacuated, Sarah corrected. Others volunteered to stay behind as what your intelligence services probably call denial assets. Our job was to make sure that anyone who tried to occupy our world would find it more trouble than it was worth.
The implications of this statement began to sink in. Sarah wasn't just a random human spoiling for a fight.
She was a trained guerrilla fighter with extensive experience in asymmetric warfare against superior forces. The fourth thing you got wrong about humans, she continued, is thinking that our willingness to die means we want to die.
We don't. We want to live. We just want to live free more than we want to live at all.
Vexstar fired 3 more shots in rapid succession, trying to bracket the area where he thought Sarah's voice was coming from. But the shots went wide, hitting nothing but empty space and cargo containers.
11 shots, Sarah noted helpfully. 19 left. This is absurd.
Vexstar snarled.
Face me directly. Fight with honor.
Honor is a luxury for people who fight wars they're expected to win, Sarah replied.
The rest of us fight to survive, and we use whatever advantages we can create.
Something small and metallic bounced off Vexstar's shoulder. When he spun to face the direction it had come from, Sarah was there, close enough to touch. But by the time he brought his weapon around, she was gone again, having used his own reflexes against him. The fifth thing you got wrong, she said from behind him, is thinking that human courage is just foolish bravery.
It's not.
It's calculated risk-taking based on accurate threat assessment and careful preparation. Vexstar whirled and fired, but hit only air.
His shots were becoming wild now, driven more by frustration than tactical thinking.
The environmental conditions Sarah had created were taking their toll on his nervous system, and her psychological warfare was proving just as effective as her physical tactics. For instance, she continued, I knew you were going to be here because I've been watching you for 3 days. I knew you'd accept my challenge because your reputation requires you to respond to public insults. I knew you'd choose this cargo bay because it was the most obviously neutral location I could suggest. And I knew you'd bring your friends because Zelkari military doctrine emphasizes overwhelming force at all tactical levels.
16 shots.
You're getting careless with your ammunition management. Vexstar realized with growing horror that he was being systematically dismantled by an opponent who had been 3 steps ahead of him from the beginning.
This wasn't a fair fight, it was an ambush disguised as single combat.
Krelty OS, he called out.
Emergency extraction.
Call for backup. But, when he looked around for his subordinate, he discovered that Krelty OS was nowhere to be seen. The young officer had apparently become lost in the maze of cargo containers and strobing lights.
He's fine, Sarah said reassuringly. Just a bit confused about which way is up. The frequency modulation I'm using interferes with Zelkari inner ear function. He'll be back to normal in a few minutes. What do you want?
Vexstar demanded. He was down to 14 shots and facing an opponent who seemed to know everything about his capabilities while revealing nothing about her own. I want you to understand something, Sarah said, her voice suddenly serious.
Those humans you killed on Kepler 7?
They weren't dying out of stupidity or stubbornness.
They were buying time. Time for what? Time for people like me to learn about people like you. Time to study your tactics, your equipment, your psychology. Time to figure out how to beat you. The truth hit Vexstar like a physical blow. You're saying their sacrifice was intelligence gathering. Those 17 colonies you conquered? Every one of them transmitted detailed tactical data before they fell.
Data about Zelkari military capabilities, weaknesses in your equipment, patterns in your strategic thinking. The Kepler 7 miners didn't just deny you their resources, they gave us a complete profile of how your forces respond under different battlefield conditions. Vexstar fired desperately, burning through his remaining ammunition in a panic-driven fusillade that accomplished nothing except confirming everything Sarah had said about his tactical limitations. 28 shots, she observed. 2 left. The strobing light suddenly stopped, returning the cargo bay to normal illumination. Sarah stepped out from behind a cargo container, completely unharmed and, apparently unconcerned about the weapon still pointed in her direction. The last thing you got wrong about humans, she said quietly, is thinking that we fight wars the way you do. We don't fight to win battles. We fight to win wars. And, sometimes winning a war means losing every battle until your enemy gets overconfident and careless. Vextar raised his weapon for one final shot, but found his hand shaking too badly to aim effectively.
The psychological pressure of the last few minutes had shattered his confidence completely. "Go ahead," Sarah said. "Take your shot. But remember that you're being recorded, and that recording is going to find its way to every human colony in this sector. They're going to see exactly how one untrained colonial auxiliary handled the great Commander Vextar in single combat." "You cheated," he said weakly. "I adapted," she corrected. "That's what humans do. That's what makes us dangerous."
Behind them, Krelteos finally emerged from the container maze, looking disoriented and embarrassed.
The other Zelkari soldiers were also beginning to recover from the environmental effects, though they seemed uncertain about what had just transpired. "Commander?" Krelteos asked tentatively.
Vextar slowly lowered his weapon, the reality of his complete tactical defeat finally sinking in. He had been outmaneuvered, outfought, and outsmarted by a single human using nothing but preparation, intelligence, and superior understanding of the battlefield. "We're leaving," he said quietly.
As the Zelkari group filed out of the cargo bay, Sarah called after them. "Commander!
Next time you're telling stories about how easily humans die, you might want to mention how hard we are to kill." The door closed behind them with a soft hiss, leaving Sarah alone in the cargo bay. She sat back down on the cargo container and activated her wrist device again, this time to transmit a coded signal.
The lesson had been taught. Now it was time to make sure it spread to the right people. Word traveled fast on a trading station.
Within 6 hours of the cargo bay incident, versions of the story were spreading through every bar, market, and meeting room in the facility. Each telling grew more elaborate, but the core facts remained consistent. Commander Vextar of the Zelkari Empire had been publicly humiliated by a single human female in what was supposed to be a demonstration of alien military superiority. Sarah Chen sat in a different cantina now, one that catered to a rougher clientele. The establishment was darker, smokier, and filled with the kind of beings who made their living in the gray areas between legal commerce and outright piracy. Here, news of a Zelkari commander's defeat was met not with nervous whispers but with open celebration. "Another round for the Deathworld girl," called out a Hajiran smuggler, raising his glass in salute.
"First human I've seen make a Zelkari wet himself without firing a shot."
Sarah accepted the drink but remained focused on the small communication device in her hand. The encrypted messages coming through confirmed what she had hoped. The recording of her encounter with Vextar was already being distributed through human resistance networks across 3 sectors. But, more importantly, it was being watched by the intelligence services of several alien governments who were growing increasingly concerned about Zelkari expansion.
Sarah's demonstration had provided them with valuable data about the psychological vulnerabilities of their potential enemies.
A shadow fell across her table. Sarah looked up to see a figure in a hooded cloak, the universal sign of someone who preferred to conduct business away from prying eyes.
"May I sit?" the figure asked in accented standard. The voice was definitely alien, though the species wasn't immediately apparent.
"Depends on what you're buying or selling," Sarah replied. The figure slid into the seat across from her.
"Information. I represent certain interests that found your performance this afternoon educational." "Glad to hear it. Always nice to meet a satisfied customer." The figure leaned forward slightly. "We have been monitoring Zelkari military activities in this region for some time. Your encounter with Commander Vextar has provided us with insights that months of conventional intelligence gathering could not achieve." Sarah took a sip of her drink, studying her visitor carefully.
The cloak concealed most identifying features, but she caught glimpses of pale skin and elongated digits that suggested membership in one of the more technologically advanced species.
"And you're telling me this because..."
"Because we would like to discuss a business arrangement."
"Your methods appear to be highly effective at exposing weaknesses in Zelkari tactical doctrine."
"We would be interested in seeing them applied more broadly."
"You want to hire me to pick fights with Zelkari commanders?" "We want to hire you to educate them about the realities of human military capabilities." "There is a difference."
Sarah set down her drink and gave the figure her full attention. This was the conversation she had been expecting ever since she agreed to take on the Vexstar assignment. The cargo bay demonstration had been as much about attracting the right kind of attention as it had been about teaching lessons to the Zelkari.
What kind of education did you have in mind?
The figure produced a data pad from beneath the cloak.
There is a Zelkari training facility on Morgana 3.
It serves as an academy for their officer corps, where young commanders learn the tactical doctrines they will employ throughout their careers.
Current estimates suggest that approximately 40% of active Zelkari military leadership has received training at this facility.
Sarah glanced at the data displayed on the pad. The facility was impressive, a full military complex with advanced simulation systems, live-fire ranges, and comprehensive training scenarios. It was exactly the kind of place where military doctrine was shaped and reinforced.
You want me to infiltrate a Zelkari military academy? We want you to apply for their exchange program. Sarah almost choked on her drink.
Their what? 6 months ago, the Zelkari Empire instituted a limited exchange program with neutral and allied species. The stated goal is to promote better understanding between different military traditions and reduce the likelihood of conflicts based on misunderstanding.
And the real goal? Intelligence gathering, obviously.
They want to study the military capabilities of other species while demonstrating their own superiority.
It's a propaganda exercise disguised as diplomacy. Sarah studied the information more carefully.
The exchange program was indeed real, though limited to a small number of carefully selected participants. Most applicants came from species with established military traditions and formal diplomatic relations with the Empire.
I'm guessing humans aren't normally invited to participate.
Correct.
However, recent diplomatic developments have created an opportunity. The Empire is under pressure from the Galactic Council to demonstrate that their military policies are not species discriminatory. Adding a human participant to their exchange program would provide valuable public relations benefits.
Especially if that human failed spectacularly and proved their point about human military incompetence.
Precisely.
They would welcome the opportunity to publicly demonstrate the inadequacy of human military training compared to their own systems. Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. It was an elegant setup. The Zelkari would essentially invite her into their most sensitive training facility because they were confident she would embarrass herself and validate their prejudices about human capabilities.
What makes you think I could get accepted into this program?
Your background, the figure replied.
Colonial auxiliary forces are technically recognized as legitimate military units under galactic law.
Your service record from Hadley's Hope, combined with appropriate diplomatic sponsorship, would make you a qualified candidate.
And where would this diplomatic sponsorship come from? The figure's posture shifted slightly, suggesting amusement.
There are several neutral governments that would be happy to sponsor a human participant in exchange for consideration of their own interests in the region. Sarah was beginning to understand the scope of what was being proposed. This wasn't just about embarrassing the Zelkari, it was part of a larger intelligence operation designed to gather detailed information about their military training methods and tactical thinking.
What exactly would be my mission objectives?
Primary objective: gather detailed intelligence about Zelkari military doctrine, training methods, and institutional culture. Secondary objective: identify weaknesses in their command structure and decision-making processes. Tertiary objective: establish contacts within their officer corps who might be useful for future operations.
And if they figure out what I'm really doing there?
Then, you become a diplomatic incident instead of an intelligence asset. But, given your performance today, we believe you are capable of maintaining operational security while achieving mission objectives. Sarah scrolled through more of the data on the pad. The Zelkari Academy was located on a heavily fortified world with multiple security layers.
Getting in would require official authorization. Getting out might be considerably more difficult. What's my cover story? Eager young human officer seeking to learn from superior Zelkari military tradition.
Your recent experiences fighting impossible odds on frontier worlds have taught you the limitations of human tactics, and you want to study more effective approaches to warfare.
They'll never believe that. They will because it's exactly what they want to hear. The Zelkari military establishment is convinced that all sentient species would benefit from adopting their methods. The opportunity to convert a human officer to their way of thinking would be irresistible to them.
The figure paused, allowing Sarah time to process the information. Around them, the cantina's clientele continued their own conversations, most of which involved various illegal activities conducted with casual openness. There is one additional factor you should consider, the figure continued.
Commander Vextar is currently stationed at the Morgana 3 facility as an instructor in xenological warfare. Sarah's expression brightened considerably. Is he now? He was reassigned there 2 days ago, ostensibly for his expertise in human military psychology. In reality, his superiors wanted him removed from active duty after today's incident became public knowledge.
So I'd be walking into a facility where one of the instructors has a personal grudge against me.
Indeed.
He would be highly motivated to demonstrate that today's encounter was an aberration rather than a representative example of human capabilities. Which gives me a perfect opportunity to prove him wrong again, this time in front of an audience of impressionable young Zelkari officers. The thought had occurred to us. Sarah finished her drink and closed the datapad. The mission was dangerous, complex, and offered numerous opportunities for things to go catastrophically wrong. It was also exactly the kind of operation that could provide valuable intelligence while striking a significant blow against Zelkari military confidence. What kind of support would I have? Financial backing for your cover identity, diplomatic credentials, communication equipment, and extraction arrangements if the mission becomes compromised. You would also have access to a network of contacts within the facility, maintenance workers, civilian contractors, and others who can provide intelligence and assistance when needed.
And if I succeed in gathering the intelligence you want? Then, several governments will be significantly better prepared to defend themselves against Zelkari aggression.
The ripple effects could extend far beyond this sector.
Sarah stood up from the table. I'll need time to consider this.
Of course.
But we should mention that the next application deadline for the exchange program is in 72 hours. If you decide to proceed, we will need to begin preparation immediately.
The figure produced a small communication device and placed it on the table. Use this if you decide to accept the mission. The encryption is military grade and the signal is untraceable.
And if I decide to decline? Then, you continue your current activities, and we find another approach to the problem.
But we believe you are uniquely qualified for this particular operation. With that, the figure rose and melted back into the crowd, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and a decision that could affect the balance of power in the sector. She picked up the communication device and examined it carefully. The technology was advanced but not immediately recognizable, suggesting that her mysterious employers had access to resources beyond those of typical intelligence agencies. Around her, the cantina's patrons continued their conversations about smuggling routes, black market weapons, and territorial disputes between various criminal organizations. But Sarah's mind was already elsewhere, considering the implications of walking into the heart of the Zelkari military establishment. The mission would require her to maintain her cover while gathering intelligence, building networks, and potentially confronting Vextar again under circumstances that would be far less favorable than their previous encounter. But it would also provide an opportunity to strike at the source of Zelkari military confidence and demonstrate that human capabilities were far more extensive than their enemies realized. She thought about the miners on Kepler 7, who had chosen to die rather than accept subjugation. Their sacrifice had provided valuable intelligence about Zelkari tactics and psychology. Now she had the chance to build on that foundation, to turn their deaths into something that could protect other human worlds from similar fates. Sarah activated the communication device and began composing her acceptance message. There were lessons to be taught, and she was just getting started. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood at the entrance to the Morgana 3 military academy, wearing the dress uniform of a Colonial Auxiliary Forces officer and carrying credentials that had cost her mysterious employers a considerable amount of diplomatic capital to arrange. The facility stretched across several kilometers of carefully manicured landscape, its buildings designed to project the power and permanence of the Zelkari Empire. The other exchange program participants had arrived over the past several days: a Korthani tactical specialist, 2 Hijiran naval officers, and a Yutani strategic analyst. Sarah was the only human, a fact that had generated considerable interest among both the academy staff and the local media. Officer Chen called a voice from behind her. She turned to see a young Zelkari in an instructor's uniform approaching. "I am Sub-Commander Thekvar. I have been assigned as your orientation guide. Pleased to meet you, Sub-Commander. I'm looking forward to learning from your instructors." Thekvar's expression suggested polite skepticism. "Indeed. Your application materials were quite unusual. It is rare for human military personnel to seek advanced training from other species. The colonial auxiliary forces have learned that survival often depends on adapting new tactics and strategies," Sarah replied diplomatically. "Recent conflicts have shown us that our traditional approaches have significant limitations. Yes, I reviewed the reports from your service on Hadley's Hope. Quite dramatic, though ultimately unsuccessful." Sarah allowed a hint of disappointment to show in her expression. "That's exactly why I'm here. We fought bravely, but bravery without proper tactical doctrine is often insufficient against professional military forces." This was clearly the response Thekvar had been hoping to hear. His manner became noticeably more friendly. "An admirable attitude. I believe you will find our curriculum quite enlightening." As they walked through the academy grounds, Sarah observed everything with the trained eye of an intelligence operative. The security arrangements, patrol patterns, communication systems, and facility layout all received careful attention. But she was equally interested in the cultural aspects of the institution: the way officers interacted with each other, the informal power structures, and the underlying assumptions that shaped Zelkari military thinking. "Your first class will be strategic planning with Commander Zalketh," Thekvar explained as they approached the main academic building. "He is considered one of our finest tactical minds, with extensive experience in both conventional and asymmetric warfare." "I'm particularly interested in asymmetric warfare," Sarah said. "That seems to be the situation humans find themselves in most often." "Indeed. Commander Zalketh has actually studied human military activities quite extensively. He has developed several theoretical frameworks for predicting and countering human tactical approaches." They entered a lecture hall where 24 young Zelkari officers were taking their seats. The room fell silent when Sarah walked in, every eye focused on the human who had come to learn from their military tradition. She took a seat near the back, noting the mixture of curiosity and condescension in the expressions around her. Commander Zalketh entered a few minutes later, a middle-aged Zelkari with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. He surveyed the class with satisfaction, his gaze lingering on Sarah for a moment longer than the others. "Today we begin our examination of asymmetric warfare," he announced. This is warfare conducted between forces of significantly different capabilities, where the weaker party attempts to compensate for their disadvantages through unconventional tactics. He activated a holographic display showing various battle scenarios. "We will be studying several examples of such conflicts, with particular attention to the psychological factors that drive inferior forces to continue fighting despite obvious disadvantages." Sarah listened as Zalketh outlined his theoretical framework for understanding human military psychology. His analysis was sophisticated but contained fundamental flaws that revealed a deep misunderstanding of human motivations and decision-making processes. "The key weakness in human military thinking," Zalketh continued, "is their tendency to conflate tactical stubbornness with strategic thinking. They often choose to fight losing battles rather than accepting more favorable terms through negotiation or surrender." One of the young officers raised his hand. "Commander, what accounts for this apparently irrational behavior?" "Excellent question, Cadet Mortim. The answer lies in the evolutionary psychology of Deathworld species. Humans evolved on a planet where individual survival often depended on aggressive responses to threats. This has created a species-wide bias toward confrontation rather than accommodation." Sarah found herself genuinely fascinated by Zalketh's analysis, not because it was accurate but
because it revealed so much about how the Zelkari viewed human capabilities. Their entire strategic doctrine was based on the assumption that humans were driven by primitive instincts rather than rational calculation. However, Zelketh continued, this psychological profile also creates predictable vulnerabilities that can be exploited by properly trained forces. We will examine several case studies where these vulnerabilities were successfully identified and targeted. The first case study was Kepler-7. Sarah listened with professional interest as Zelketh described the tactical situation from the Zelkari perspective. His analysis of the mining colony's defensive capabilities was accurate, but his interpretation of their final actions was completely wrong. The human decision to destroy their own facilities rather than surrender demonstrates the kind of wasteful thinking that characterizes their species, Zelketh explained. They gain nothing from this action except the satisfaction of denying resources to their betters. Sarah raised her hand. Permission to ask a question, Commander? Zelketh nodded, clearly pleased to have an opportunity to enlighten an actual human about their species' shortcomings. Of course, Officer Chen. I encourage active participation in these discussions. I'm curious about the strategic value of the Kepler-7 operation from the Empire's perspective. What specific objectives were achieved by taking control of the system? The question clearly caught Zelketh off guard. He had expected Sarah to ask about tactical details, not strategic outcomes. The operation successfully removed a human presence from a strategically important location. But, what made the location strategically important? And, was that importance maintained after the destruction of the mining infrastructure? Zelketh's expression showed a flicker of irritation. The system provided access to mineral resources and served as a potential staging area for further human expansion. So the strategic value was dependent on the infrastructure that the humans destroyed, Sarah observed. From their perspective, denying the Empire those resources might have been worth more than preserving their own lives. That assumes they were capable of rational strategic calculation, Zelketh replied dismissively. The evidence suggests otherwise. What evidence specifically? The question hung in the air for a moment. Zelketh had clearly not expected to be challenged by a student, particularly a human student who was supposedly there to learn from superior Zelkari wisdom. The evidence, he said slowly, is that they chose death over life. No rational being makes such a choice unless driven by primitive instincts rather than logical thinking. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting perspective. In human strategic thinking, we sometimes refer to that kind of decision as acceptable losses in service of strategic objectives. But, I can see how it might appear irrational from an outside perspective. The room was becoming uncomfortably quiet. Several of the young officers were beginning to realize that their supposedly ignorant human classmate was asking questions that their instructor was having difficulty answering satisfactorily. Zelketh attempted to regain control of the discussion. Perhaps, Officer Chen, you would care to share the human perspective on the Kepler-7 incident? I'm sure we would all benefit from hearing how your species justifies such wasteful tactics. Sarah stood up, recognizing the trap that was being set for her. This was her opportunity to begin the educational process she had come here to conduct. Well, Commander, from the human perspective, the Kepler-7 miners achieved several important strategic objectives. First, they denied valuable resources to an aggressive enemy force. Second, they demonstrated to other human colonies that resistance was possible even against overwhelming odds. Third, they forced the Empire to expend significant military resources for zero strategic gain. She paused, scanning the faces of the young officers around her. But, most importantly, they sent a clear message to the Empire about the cost of expansion into human space. Every future operation would have to account for the possibility that humans would choose mutual destruction rather than submission. That is not a sustainable strategy, Zelketh objected. A species cannot survive by constantly destroying itself. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. It's not sustainable for a species that's fighting to preserve the status quo. But, for a species that's fighting to change the strategic balance of power, it can be extremely effective. Explain. Sarah moved to the front of the classroom, taking advantage of Zelketh's invitation to elaborate.
Every military operation has costs and benefits. The Empire's expansion strategy depends on achieving strategic objectives at an acceptable cost.
But, if humans consistently make those costs unacceptable, then, the strategy becomes unsustainable. She gestured to the holographic display. Look at the Kepler-7 operation from a cost-benefit perspective.
The Empire committed 3 battle groups and lost 2,000 soldiers to gain control of a system with no remaining infrastructure.
That's not victory, that's a tactical success with strategic failure.
One of the cadets spoke up.
But, the humans still died. How is death preferable to life under Empire protection?
That depends on how you define life, Sarah replied.
Humans tend to distinguish between biological existence and meaningful existence.
We value freedom, autonomy, and self-determination as essential components of life worth living. Zalketha's expression had shifted from condescension to genuine concern. This conversation was not going according to his carefully planned curriculum.
Such philosophical distinctions are irrelevant in military planning. Victory goes to the force that achieves its objectives while maintaining operational capability.
I agree completely, Sarah said.
Which brings me to my next question: what exactly were the Empire's strategic objectives in human space, and how successfully have they been achieved?
The room fell silent again. Sarah had just challenged the fundamental premise of Zelkari military policy in the region, and she had done it using their own analytical framework. Our objectives are the establishment of peace and order in accordance with galactic law, Zalketh said stiffly.
And, has human resistance to those objectives increased or decreased following operations like Kepler-7? Before Zalketh could answer, the classroom door opened and another instructor entered.
Sarah recognized him immediately despite the formal military setting.
Commander Vextar had arrived for what was clearly a pre-arranged demonstration of human military incompetence.
But, as he surveyed the scene in front of him, Sarah standing at the front of the classroom while Zalketh struggled to maintain control of his own lecture, his expression shifted to one of alarmed recognition.
"Ah, Commander Vextar," Zalketh said with obvious relief. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing human tactical psychology.
Perhaps you could share some of your field experience with our students?" Vextar's eyes locked with Sarah's across the classroom. For a moment, neither of them moved.
Then, Sarah smiled and offered a respectful nod. "Actually," she said, "I think Commander Vextar and I have already met. Perhaps he could provide the class with his perspective on human capabilities based on our previous encounter?"
The trap had been sprung, but not in the way anyone had expected. Sarah had turned her presence at the academy into an opportunity to confront the Zelkari military establishment with the gap between their theories about human weakness and the reality of human capabilities. Vextar stood frozen in the doorway, realizing that his humiliation at the trading station had followed him to the one place where his reputation was supposed to be safe. Around him, 24 young officers waited to hear how their instructor would respond to a direct challenge from the human who had already proven his theories wrong.
The real education was just beginning.